So, welcome everybody to this session where we're going to be talking about drones. We're going to be talking about how to keep our skies safe and look at how we put in place the systems to use drones safely and address unauthorised drone flight. I've got a fantastic panel here for a very fascinating 45-minute discussion. We'll just quickly kick off with just introducing ourselves. I'll go first. My name is Mark Westwood, and I'm the CTO at Connected Places Catapult. We've got a strong interest in the drone services sector, particularly in helping UK companies drive economic growth in this sector. So I'm really looking forward to a stimulating conversation on this. And we just introduce Jeffrey.
Hi, my name's Jeff Moore, and I'm a security consultant from Arup. Arup help design and build some of the world's most iconic facilities all around the world, including the development of major city infrastructure. My background is in technical security, specifically around the defence and critical infrastructure sector. And for the last few years, I've been very closely involved in counter-drone solutions.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and just hand over to Katia.
Hello, I'm Katia Samuel. I'm the CEO of Global Security and Disaster Management Limited, GSDM. We're an independent consultancy focusing on training and resilience work, in particular to conventional and emerging technological risk, including drones. So my own background is I'm an international lawyer, and I focus on security, resilience, and disaster risk.
Thank you, Katia. And Sean.
Hello, everybody. Yes, Sean Camilleri from Collins Aerospace. I have a background in digital capability implementation, and my interest is really about enabling UTM, really about enabling fair, equitable, and safe access to the UK's airspace.
Thank you very much. And then finally, Corinne.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. My name's Karim Kozlit, and I'm the head of growth for Horizon, which is a product of Thales. Thales is an international global company, 80,000 strong, and we specialize in space, aerospace, defense, cybersecurity, and ground transportation. Thales in this space is trusted by key ATM decision makers in over 170 countries around the world. And my particular interest is in Horizon. It's a digital product designed for the operational governance and compliance and safety management of drone operations. My background is military, and for the last 8 years, I've specialized in drones as a solution to solve people's problems.
Well, thank you very much. And great to have such a breadth of experience and knowledge here to talk about this fascinating subject. And certainly from a personal background, I've had the fortune to be involved in the drones industry for some time, and it's been fascinating to see how that has grown, particularly in visual line of sight applications. And really, the one of the exciting questions now is how does the industry scale, and how do we do that in a safe and equitable way? So I wonder, does anyone want to kick off with just giving your sort of personal observations on what you think the opportunity here is for drones and drone services? Jeffrey.
Thanks. Well, I think that there can't be any real doubt that there's definitely a use case for a number of new forms of aerial transportation and logistics modes. We're all very well of the sort of the imaginary Jetsons future and the flying cars we've seen in many of the movies, and I think a lot of that is very attractive. And I think that we can see use cases all the time for a variety of different unmanned and remotely operated vehicles, whether they be on the ground or in the air. The question is how we get from here to there, and particularly given the complexities and the risks associated with operating a variety of different sizes and scales of unmanned aerial vehicle, from tiny palm-sized devices that weigh a few grams, all the way up to the projected concept of flying taxis, which have to carry multiple people and their luggage, and potentially even a pilot. and how we actually make those modes of transport work in a way that makes sense, both from a security and safety perspective, in very crowded infrastructure, where and one of the major drivers we keep being told behind trying to put more traffic into the air is that the ground is very crowded. But how do we actually make that? How do we make that transition to the sky in an environment that is already cluttered? It's already risky, and we're already having difficulties managing the traffic on the ground without actually adding an extra dimension to it. I think we can see that there are a number of areas of technology that are really interested, and we get a lot of technology advocates that are pushing for specific use cases in specific areas, where maybe they've got a vehicle that they want to sell, or maybe a service that they'd like to offer. But the important factor that seems to be missing is how we actually integrate those services into urban areas, including into airports, to provide intermodal transfer of passengers and freight and logistics, to deliver those services into those highly crowded urban spaces while still maintaining people's quality of life, and also not disrupting communities in a way that the conventional general aviation sector has failed to do. After 100 years of evolution, we still have, for most people, their biggest issues, if they live next to an airport, they may well have in the back of their mind environmental issues around emissions and the like, but actually what they're worried about on a day-to-day basis is congestion, it's noise, it's other simple social issues that affect their quality of life. And if we're going to introduce more vehicles into the airspace, we need to do that not only in a way that's secure, but in a way that's sympathetic with the way communities work, and how the business models are going to be created, which are actually viable to support those services on those vehicles in those environments.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I mean, very, very good initial points there, I think, particularly around the fact that technology push here is not necessarily the answer, and it's a much broader system of systems type approach that's needed. Karim, I think there was something that you wanted to bring in on this point.
Yeah, I think the points that Jeffrey's made there are really important. And I think if we remember that aviation as a whole is 100 years old, and that drones are not particularly new, we're talking about an industry that's growing from an RC, a toy background, effectively, probably 20, 30 years ago. And we've matured that technology to such an amazing extent now. We've got the birth of the giants of the manufacturers, and the uptake and the price point of these drones being used so widely for a range of different tasks. I've been involved in projects for close visual inspections, for surveys, from anything from bees to bridges around the world. So there's such a wide variation of use case for drones that we want to be able to use these things. And it was interesting, some points there that Jeffrey raised around risk, security and safety. And I think these are really good points that we can look at from a governmental perspective, and the government is, the first duty of the government is to look after its people. But I think there's other issues. Again, I like I had written down societal issues, but I like Jeffrey's terminology there with sympathy, having sympathetic use of drones to the population, and ensuring that they're being used in a way that is being accepted by society. I think is a major block currently. To a wider acceptance, which will get us along the path towards urban air mobility.
Well, thank you, Karim, for some excellent points there, and I think you've sort of highlighted the contrast between the exciting technological future, but also the potential for that to be affected by some of the potential threats. Now, Katya, I'm sure you've got some very interesting sort of legal perspectives on that. Perhaps you'd like to talk us through those.
I see it's sort of there's two sides to the coin. One is the resilience that the increased use of drones can bring, and we've really seen that sort of catapulted in terms of usage during COVID-19 and using wonderful medical ways and commercial ways. But the other side of the coin, I think, is really important from a resilience point of view, is making sure that all relevant threat risks and vulnerabilities are identified, that they're considered, that they're integrated together. So, for example, within the UTM space, clearly much of the aviation thinking informs the handling of drones, but sometimes that can lead to disproportionate responses or concepts as well, in that clearly the risk of a small drone falling out of the sky is very different to an aircraft. And where I see some challenges at the moment going forward is making sure that we include all relevant security aspects. So terrorism, for example, think of foreign fighters. Islamic State had a very advanced drone unit in Iraq and Syria. We know that that technology has been exported, it's been used in other parts of the world. What does that pose to us? Because with increased resilience of technology, actually comes increased resilience for terrorists as well. On the disaster risk perspective, what happens if we lose power and the UTM systems doesn't work, whether for an extreme weather event or through a cyber incident? So I think going forward, it's really exciting, the landscape, but just making sure that in line with the technological innovation, the associated risks are all properly mapped out and considered in parallel as well.
Thank you very much, Chatia. So, and some very good points that you raised there. And I guess as we all would probably agree that a technology like UTM has got a role to play here in scaling the industry. But Sean, perhaps maybe you could expand on the role that UTM has to play in terms of addressing the issues that Katia was just raising there, and also supporting scale as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, so I believe that by combining services, so UTM, traffic management services, along with some of the periphery services, command and control networks especially, enable us to deploy capability that can help to mitigate some of that risk. So some of those foundational services, such as registration, remote ID, and the electronic conspicuity, they enable us to both strategically and tactically deconflict and segregate airspace users. And of course, in the longer term, we expect a convergence of air traffic management with UTM in order to unify the airspace and reduce some of that risk. So programs, the UK is a great place to do that right now with programs such as the Open Access UTM program and the Future Flight Challenge, where we're able to partner and collaborate in order to test and refine those strategies and techniques, to prove that we truly can mitigate that risk and then scale, from low level flight operations to really national operations in fully integrated airspace.
Thank you very much, Sean. And two programs very close to my heart: Future Flight Challenge and the Open Access UTM work that you've also described, that DFT have been promoting. I think you also touched on a really interesting point there around the convergence of UTM and ATM, and I wonder whether there's some. I mean, there's clearly some challenges there. Jeffrey, maybe you've got some thoughts there on how we bring together those actually often quite different communities of the long established aviation professionals and the sort of drone innovators.
Yeah, the only thing really that the two markets share is the one sky. They're on a basis of operations. The scales are at either end of the spectrum, from the general aviation market, which is relatively small in comparison to what the potential is for small flying objects around our cities. One of the areas I think that is often either avoided or maybe ignored is that things like ATM and UTM are services. And people don't often think about what the infrastructure is that sits underneath those services to actually deliver them to the users of those services. And that's actually where I think some of the critical vulnerabilities within the whole concept around urban air mobility currently lies. Commerciality always wins. The availability of low-cost services on platforms that somebody else has already paid for, or what leverage things like cloud services into the market. The ability of anybody to write an app and deliver it out through an app store right now into people's phones is made possible by the fact that somebody else owns all the computers and all of the internet and all of the infrastructure and all of the wireless systems that provide that connectivity between those services. And it makes it really easy and really cheap for people to create a service and then deliver it out to a large user base very rapidly and very easily. But they don't own any of it. They only own that very small piece, which is the service on top, which generates the revenue, which is fine if you're developing a new version of Angry Birds, but it's not quite the case if you're putting in place systems which are effectively going to become elements of critical national infrastructure in the future when we start having aircraft flying around our cities delivering people and services and goods. So we need to be really, really cognizant on how that infrastructure is built up underneath these systems to make it resilient enough to be able to survive the kinds of incidents that Katya has mentioned, major natural events, criminal events, organized crime, terrorism, and the way they might have, and hostile foreign actors, and how they might have an influence on that infrastructure. But the risk is that commerciality will win out, and the people that will end up providing that infrastructure are the people who are able to do it most cheaply, and that's probably going to be the mobile phone companies, and that might not be the best way to go.
Very interesting points, and I guess somewhere in there's a trade-off between the sort of free market approach to, I think you described it as the commerciality wins out versus the national resilience perspective. Now, Katya, from your perspective, do you see any analogies with how other markets have tackled this particular problem, that trade-off, and made those calls?
It was really interesting, just on that point of commerciality. Because from a resilience perspective, this is a trend both within the UK and internationally, is that there can be an unwillingness to invest in overall resilience. And by that, I mean proper consideration of all relevant threats and risks, and investing sufficiently in preparedness, response, the planning and the recovery point. And where part of the irony is, I've done quite a lot of work with the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, including man-made and technological risk. And one of the statistics which is frequently cited is that for each dollar invested in disaster risk, $18 of disaster loss and damage is avoided and saved. So actually, where I think there's a trend to be challenged is for increased investment, not only in developing our innovative technology, but thinking sort of more 360 degrees about all the potential risks and what simple measures can be taken to reduce them. So, for example, one, low cost is even in the whole area of drone awareness, recognition, and understanding about what drones can and can't do. So you've got, on the one scale, one end, underreaction to overreaction. It all results in loss and damage, whether it's economic, whether it's reputationally. So in terms of trends which could be addressed, things like basic training, so that key people, and I think increasingly communities, can recognise, as we see more drone usage, about what's a hostile drone, what isn't, how do you distinguish between a crane light and a drone. So I think that whole commercial argument from both public and private sector organisations, including CNI, is a paradigm to be challenged and rethink where some of the investment is made.
Thank you. Some very, very good points there. And I guess maybe that leads on to the next question that I've got is really around how do we think this market is going to develop in the UK, and what do we think? What would our asks be to government and to regulator in helping to both support a really active market, but one that's got resilience and long-term sustainability? Sean, do you want to just kick us off with your thoughts in that area?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mentioned the Open Access UTM project and the Future Flight Challenge project, and I see these types of initiatives as being really key. No one can solve this problem alone. It needs to be tackled through collaboration, and these programs also bring the regulators to the table. Not just the regulators. You have stakeholders from all over who sometimes you wouldn't imagine need to participate in in these enabling projects, but getting access, bringing together industry with the public, with the regulators, with companies like Katya's to help understand all of the impacts of these potential early operations, and then design these services most effectively from the start, with full cooperation, to make that a success. So these types of programs are really key. The UK is not the only country doing that. In between all of those various programs, by bringing the right people together, that's how we're going to succeed.
And Karim, what are your thoughts on that particular area?
I think that there's an enormous narrative from the industry about unlocking the potential of drones. I think we're only scratching the surface of what drones can do for us, to automate our society, to do the things that we don't want to do, along with delivering your pizza or delivering your order from online retailers. I think there's a lot of technology that needs to be advanced, and there's many angles that need to be addressed in a really short space of time. The technology exists now for us to physically be able to do those things. It's whether we are able to do them technologically is less the question. It's more about kind of societal acceptance. It's more about the law, the regulators, the CAA. We recently did a project with COVID-19 for the NHS in Scotland, where we flew an aircraft beyond visual line of sight, a technological advancement, really well supported by the Department for Transport and the Civil Aviation Authority. They prioritised our requirement, that of the NHS's, what we needed to unlock that environment, and we were able to prove the value of that project. The key for us now is to do that at scale, and being able to unlock that nationally and internationally in a really cooperative, safe, secure, legal way that people accept is a huge challenge.
And would you, what would your ask be to either government or, for example, the NHS in supporting, exactly that kind of innovation? Because you brought forward a really good example, and I think it's not one that's just exclusive to the drones industry. In that the COVID-19 pandemic has seen lots of impossibles become possible, and overcome lots of barriers that people would have said were too difficult. Now we've seen exactly how this technology can be deployed for such a good example of a use case. What would your ask be?
To work with us, really, to be engaging and collaborative. I noticed, with the CAA, they've split out the regulator from an innovation cell. And the innovation department itself is really well led. It's funded by DFT and the CAA, and they're really able to now engage stakeholders. You can have the craziest idea, but if you're able to demonstrate it to the CAA and it adds value to the industry, they'll allow you to test that, to demonstrate it, to evaluate it. They'll give you regulator feedback. You can have user groups to test these things. And the sandbox is a really good way of government engaging at a regulatory level with the people who are driving the technology forward and trying to unlock use cases and ultimately commercialize a service, or from a government perspective, deliver something that offers value or reduces risk.
Thank you very much. I I think the call out on the CAA for their innovation hub is a really good one. We're very fortunate to have a specific funding stream in the UK looking at the role that regulation has to play in innovation, and what the CAA have been doing most recently is a great example of trying to introduce new thinking, I think, into what is a sector that's underpinned with a new type of technology. And in many ways, it reminds me a lot of the work that's also going on in the autonomous ground vehicle sector. We've seen lots of parallel activity into societal acceptance and legal frameworks and autonomy, and that's brought in organisations like the Law Commission to do reviews of various pieces of legislation. And Katya, what would you what do you think government should be looking to do on the legal side, particularly, I guess, as we start to evolve from drone operations at the moment are quite often effectively remotely operated, with a one-to-one mapping of operator to platform. As we move into a sort of a scaled future where we might have one person controlling lots of things, what are the really thorny legal aspects we need to consider in that area?
In the whole area of technological innovation, including in the drone space, legal input tends to be very narrow and very limited. So, for example, the reasons I've mentioned, it focuses primarily on sort of aviation, safety, security related issues. There's aspects of crime prevention and nuisance, which is part of the conversation. But again, if I might come back to this whole issue that I think is absolutely critical, the need for more integrated threat, risk, hazard, vulnerability mapping to take place, then you would start to bring other aspects like intangible technology transfer, the impact of dual use technology, three-dimensional printers. So, for example, within the international legal framework, there are significant gaps and vulnerabilities because the legal framework was designed at a time that much of the current technology doesn't exist. So it's currently not an international crime to share weapon blueprints or to use the internet to share them. And we've seen, for example, Islamic State, them use three-dimensional printers for drones and other weapon technology. So that's a real gap. From a legal and doctrinal perspective as well, I was, delighted that in October last year that the UK introduced its counter-unmanned aircraft strategy. If I might say, I was slightly depressed when I read that it looks at education, it looks at technological innovation, which are hugely important. But I was concerned about what it missed out, including on the resilience side. And going forward, my request of government would be that is to say that all the key partners and all the key thinking are not currently sat around the table. And as we develop these roadmaps in terms of our doctrine, our strategies, our frameworks, legal, non-legal, it's critical to have all of those relevant factors considered and round the table. And if I might just add one other aspect that I sometimes get concerned, and I've seen this in relation to autonomous shipping, is that there's been a parallel of focus on safety with only nominal contribution discussion of disaster risk and security. And I think there are so many factors in this rapidly evolving landscape that really we risk own goals. And I hope that we never become complacent, but rather this sense of evergreening, that we always try and have all of the relevant factors tracking in parallel with each other, both the innovation and the risk. And if I might make one final comment on that, is that one of the things that we've seen from weaponized drone attacks, which is definitely an emerging a new risk, and drone swarms. If we look at the attack on the Saudi oil installations last year, one of the key lessons is, regardless of what technological innovation you may or may not have in place, it cannot alone make you resilient. So that must be that adaptiveness, flexibility, capability, planning, preparedness. It needs to be more of the conversation.
And just to bring you back to one of the excellent points you were making a second ago around integrated threat mapping, I mean, are there good examples of other sectors who are addressing this in the way that exactly you described that this industry should be learning from?
Not especially. I've spent the last 4 years looking at this, and that's one of the things that GSDM what we're doing. And in part, it's because my own background is not only legal, but it's military, it's operational, it's practitioner within both the security, the disaster risk, and the resilience space. What I saw in terms of recurring gaps and vulnerabilities is that traditionally, with just a few exceptions, people tend to approach these issues, such as technological innovation, through the single paradigm that they operate with. It's law enforcement, whether it's disaster risk, whether it's safety. And where some of the greatest gaps and vulnerabilities exist is actually where these three paradigms interconnect. And much of it, it isn't rocket science. It's not difficult to address, but it does involve rethinking some of our approaches and making sure that we're bringing the different factors together into a more integrated whole.
Thank you very much. And I guess if we think about how the industry might work together to address some of these collaboration gaps. I mean, Sean, you talked earlier about experience with the open access UTM program. What do you think have been the strengths of that approach, and what do you think should be brought in to try and address some of the points that Katia was just raising?
Yeah, so I think it's probably a good time to talk about simulation. One of the things that's been very difficult to do, and is still very difficult to do, is to go and test out your theories in real life, because of the elements of risk and the lack of regulations and standards. So one of the ways we've been trying to address that is through simulation, by simulating lots of scenarios, but by bringing both hardware in the loop and people in the loop into those simulations. So being able to take some services from one organization, some services from another organization, that builds up that full ecosystem that enables the safe integration of drones, and then being able to test that out in a virtual environment, but with real people in the loop. I think that's one way we can really mitigate the risk, and is certainly getting a lot of interest now in the industry, because you don't need to disrupt existing operations. You don't need to establish all of that new infrastructure up front, only to realize that actually we need to make significant changes and then affect previous investments. So I think simulation is a great way that we can address some of those challenges and prepare ourselves as best we can for what the future looks like.
Yeah, I think the role of simulation and digital twins is an often used term at the moment, but the role of tools like that to play in design and operational decision making is the full potential still to be explored. But lots of different organisations have lots of different simulations. I'm wondering what you, Karim, what you might think around the role of standards, or the role standards could play to help make those sort of system-wide simulations more representative and more accessible.
Sure, it's a really good point. So Thales does a lot of work in the digital twin space for various different areas, especially with our ground transportation business, where we'll look at modelling different arenas and how to conduct different interventions without affecting a railway or a road or other similar kind of major infrastructure, as Sean was saying. Standards is a really interesting case across the piece that we haven't really touched upon, because there's the standards with regards to modelling and extrapolating data that you can then apply to the real world when you're actually doing an operation for real at scale. But there's also standards of a range of different elements, including UTM, which we don't have at the moment. ASTM in America is looking at various mechanisms for the remote ID, for electronic conspicuity, which was mentioned earlier, again, I think by Sean as well. But the standards across the piece are being taken in isolation, with British standards and international standards, American standards, all being separate. And I think if we listen to what Katia said earlier, bringing government in on that journey whilst they're helping to resolve the innovation and what technology can be used for and unlock, that the background technological aspects have to be looked after, and standards are a real kind of piece in development that need to be kind of really refocused on and doubled down on for us to ensure that we're talking the same language nationally and internationally.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's something that organisations like BSI would be absolutely behind. And if we just move slightly back to the digital twins area, I'm conscious that we've talked a lot about UTM and airspace, and that's one angle. But thinking, Jeffrey, from your perspective at Arup, with the experience of the built environment and the other sort of sectors that interact with the airspace, how do you feel that the simulation aspect could interact to help us use the places better?
Well, one thing that really hasn't been addressed at all in the urban environment, particularly around security and risk, is the inclusion of the third dimension. Perimeter security in most applications, including in airports, quite bizarrely, still only requires you to build a fence around the facility in order to secure it, which clearly doesn't do an awful lot to stop drones from flying in legally or illegally. So, but that extends really into the urban space as well, where we're seeing drones being used for simple ad hoc tasks like building inspections and the like, and gathering information for FM providers and for energy loss and the like. But we have no way of actually controlling those, or controlling or monitoring the influence of those vehicles as they move up and down the outside of office buildings that probably are leaking data all over the place because they've got a million different wireless access points that usually would be completely safe because they're protected up in the sky by this wonderful access control system called the law of gravity, which stops anybody from getting up there. But we have to start thinking about how we move out into that three-dimensional space. We integrate our physical security management systems that look after premises with the new type of intruder, and the new type of intruder are intruders that act at a distance. They're intruders that invade into spaces that previously you wouldn't have been able to or needed to protect. And they're the intruders that are already inside. They're the insider threat people, and these areas are things that are not taken a great deal of notice in. Just one point I want to make about a lot of this as well is we've actually spoken a little bit about this concept of human on the loop and human over the loop situations where people are still included in the control of UAS, which is likely to remain the case for quite some time, particularly in higher frequency, higher tempo applications or with larger vehicles, and that's very likely to be the case. But one really important question is, who are those people? What are they? Are they pilots? Are they skilled pilots? How many vehicles should they be able to look after at a time? Doing what kind of operations? How would they intervene? If something went wrong, how would they connect to a vehicle? If it's flying inside the urban canyon where you've got virtually no mobile phone coverage, how are you going to do anything that's actually going to make any difference if you allow that to happen? So there's a whole set of pieces of infrastructure there that don't currently exist. How you identify the skills that you require, how you train those, how you find those people, how you train them, how do you create effectively the air traffic control towers for that unmanned landscape, both on the ground and in the air, which currently doesn't exist. And we speak a lot of people talk about this sort of concept of the crawl, walk, run evolution of unmanned aviation. But it's really hard to see how that can evolve. There's no organic path for that to happen. We're not starting from anywhere. The analogy would be in the rest of the transportation space. It would be like having factories making bicycles, cars, and trucks without any roads, without any traffic lights, without any petrol stations. Why would that work? So we need to find a way. To help government identify the areas where they can create a platform, and that platform is what's going to support the drone economy, so that small operators who have an idea about a service that they might be able to provide via a vehicle that they buy in from somebody else and a subscription that they take out with somebody's UTM solution, that will enable them to offer that service out into the community and generate revenue from it, and hence kickstart the drone economy here as well as elsewhere. And that's where I think that the big level of investment is required, is to create those roads and petrol stations and traffic lights that don't currently exist. Write the highway code, because it still doesn't exist. And a lot of the drone-related legislation that's been aimed to go through Parliament for quite some time has been delayed by other matters, the one beginning with a big B and the one beginning with a big C. And those issues have stopped those things from being resolved, and we need to get those roadblocks out of the way if we're going to have a drone economy at all.
So I think that's a really good summary of the point that we were talking about earlier, which is really about the role of government is here to stimulate the market. And I guess that was a passionate manifesto for the build it and they will come case. And perhaps as we draw the session to a close, I think we've fascinating discussion, and I think we've all agreed that it's a sector that's got massive potential. It's a sector that we can't just rely on the market to generate solutions for itself. I mean, there's clearly a need for some government intervention to create the market in a shape that's not just commercially viable, but also beneficial to society and also protects us from misuse of this technology. And we talked a lot about things like the role of simulation and standards in helping us navigate through that sort of development route. But perhaps we could just finish with your sort of final thoughts as to what you'd like to see happen next in this sector as the most important next step. And perhaps Katya, you could lead us off with that.
I think there's a fantastic opportunity, including the UK, to become even more of a sort of standard setter than already is. And certainly discussions I've had internationally, often the UK is referred to as, in terms of setting standards, and a country to model, which has a lot of influence in many countries. And where I see real opportunities for us, both within what we do within the UK and overseas, is even as this sort of the mixed backgrounds that we have on this panel illustrate that when we've got all the key players sat around the table, the potential to develop a unique global standard setting template of end-to-end solutions for the management of drones, not only for UES, but within the other spaces as well, I think are significant. And my final comment to the government would be, this is one that you really need to seize, as we've got such an opportunity.
Thank you very much, Katya. And Sean, your thoughts?
Yeah, sorry. I think it's all about continued investment, and Jeff mentioned a lot about the infrastructure that needs to be in place. It's very difficult to just deploy a new national infrastructure covering the whole of the UK, but small projects, trial areas, test corridors, test sites are really important in establishing systems that can potentially work, and allowing us to learn from those and then to scale them out. So I think it's continued investment on the infrastructure side, and then openness from the regulators and the governments to try new things, in well-controlled environments.
So start small and scale quickly, I think was the message there. Karim, your thoughts?
I'm going to keep mine super brief. Carpe diem and seize tomorrow. Build an environment that's conducive to open discussions, to enable many people to engage in the conversation, and not to fear failure, I guess. As a government, as a standards organization, as industry, let's not worry about failing. Let's worry about failing to do it right, but let's not do anything at all. Let's do something, assess it, judge it, and grow together.
I think that's a very useful reminder of the risk of not doing anything at all. And finally, Jeffrey.
Oh, well, in short, I think that one of the great areas of opportunity that there are right now is to seize the areas of technology that are actually most available. The move to short-haul electric aviation for short-haul transportation, to revitalize areas of the country that currently have got a well-educated, agile workforce that we can start to utilize, and to use this as a lever to push infrastructure out into other parts of the country. And that infrastructure, many parts of it, and the way that control mechanism will begin to be established, will enable us to create bubbles, the kind of bubbles that Sean was talking around infrastructure that will encourage the use of autonomy. If those platforms are made available for local enterprise to be able to use that capability to launch themselves off, I think what we can see as a nation, I think that we can see amazing things. And that capability, I work with DIT and DSO all the time, and that capability can be exported all over the world because nobody is really leading in this. Everybody is making a lot of noise and publishing a lot of documents, and often government and regulators are doing a different thing entirely than what product manufacturers and vendors are looking for, what they're doing. I think we need to find a way to actually lead that charge, and we can do that in the UK.
Well, I think that's a brilliantly optimistic note to finish this discussion on. I'd just like to thank you all for your time, for your insights, and look forward to seeing you all in a physical Farnborough sometime, hopefully in the not too distant future. So thank you very much.